So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for making the time on a Friday morning, bright and early. I know some of you are coming from at least as far as Edmonton, so it's like 7 in the morning in Edmonton, and I think some of you are coming from the UK. So it's really awesome to have such a kind of broad range of interest in the topic. My name is Ajay Parasram, and I'm one of the organizers along with Fatima Bedouin and John Cameron. I'm pointing, but it's not like you can see what I'm pointing at, but they're here with us as well. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about why we put together the event, and then I'm going to take you through and introduce you to our wonderful speakers and just tell you how we're going to proceed. So, you know, obviously, I'd like to start first by acknowledging the territory that I'm on, that many of us, most of us, I think, are here in Mi'kma'ki, which is unceded Mi'kmaq territory, which is knotted up in this process of what I like to call the colonial present. It's a bit of a misnomer that colonialism ever ended. It just sort of transformed into various different kinds of institutional ways. And that's largely what a lot of the people who motivated us to organize this event in the first place kind of inspired us to focus on the colonial continuities of the present. The territory's been covered by a series of treaties, but I think it's important to note that even preceding these treaties, there is a political practice and ethic of sovereignty that has existed for thousands of years. And that is really the essence of sovereign legitimacy on this land. And then into that come other waves of migrants. And in particular, I'd like to recognize the African Nova Scotian presence that came here through the processes of colonization. And as we are meeting in African Heritage Month, Black History Month, I think it's particularly important to be cognizant of the relationship and solidarities that have always existed between the Mi'kmaq population indigenous to this land and the African Nova Scotian population that have arrived under different circumstances. And then over top of that come waves of settlers. And anyway, but we could talk about that for hours. But that's the context upon where we're starting here, especially for those of you who aren't based in Mi'kma'ki. So what this is, originally before the pandemic, we just had this idea that, all these, especially Black Lives Matter and all these youth activists were just doing such incredible work through 2018, 2019 in terms of street level activism. And we just thought, how can we help them do what they're doing even more so? So we thought, we're a couple of nerds in the university, so we know a few things about public policy, and we know another group of people who could probably say a lot on that subject. So we thought, let's just kind of add something to what people are already doing. So we just wanted to try and be helpful to the work that people were already engaged in doing. And then we were planning on doing this. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, so we put it off. And now we're doing it online. So that's basically where we're coming from. So our motivation is not to try and teach anybody anything, but we want to create a space to deepen our collective understanding about how activism and public policy advocacy can kind of work together in some ways. So we gathered a panel of experts who have a diverse skill set on this. And I'll just introduce the panel now and then quickly thank our sponsors before we kick it off. So first on my list here is Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a poet, scholar, journalist, and advocate. She was the 5th Poet Laureate in Halifax and the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. She's also a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, an amazing radio show on CKDU-FM, developed collectively with prisoners. And her advocacy and work fights anti-Black racism in Canada, walking in the path of the great-grandmothers who resisted relentlessly. She has been a fierce opponent of structural white supremacy and colonialism in all of its many forms. I checked, there's lots of them. And most recently, Ella was asked to define defunding the police by the Halifax Board of Police Commissioners. I'm hoping we'll end up talking a little bit about that later too. Next, we have Dr. Christine Saulnier, who's the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and my next door neighbor. She has a doctorate in political science from York University and leads the living wage calculations for communities in Atlantic Canada. and has served as co-author of the annual Child and Family Poverty Report Cards for Nova Scotia, which has been hugely significant over the years, and particularly this year. So she's also a frequent media commentator on fiscal policy, minimum wage, a wide range of social policies, including childcare and income assistance. So welcome to both of you. And then last and certainly not least, we have Lisa Roberts, who was elected for the NDP as the MLA for Halifax Needham, also here in the community, in August 2016 by-elections, and then re-elected the very next year. So wow, that must have been a busy couple of years. She currently serves as the Public Accounts Committee, on the Public Accounts Committee in the Nova Scotia Legislature. She's the NDP spokesperson on agriculture, housing, municipal affairs, Acadian affairs, immigration, fisheries, land, forestry, and internal services. So Lisa's busy. She's also on the side, the Deputy House Leader of the New Democrats as well. And particularly awesome for John and I, Lisa is an alumni of DAL. She has a master's in development economics and a BA in international development studies, where she studied all kinds of postmodernism to turn her inside out. So welcome to all three of you. Thank you for that. So this event has been made possible by the generous support of the ACIC, the CCPA, Nova Scotia office, the McCacken Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and the Department of International Development Studies. Wow, that's a mouthful. Right, so I just want to tell you then about how we're going to proceed in the next 2 minutes, and then we're going to jump right into it, the conversation. So the first section of the conversation is going to last about 55 minutes or so. We're going to go until just before 11. And it's going to be a facilitated conversation between Christine, Lisa, and Elle, and myself. And then I'm going to hand over my moderation hat to Fatima, who is going to then lead a section where we're going to ask the BIPOC activists or BIPOC young people in the audience to step forward with their questions, contributions, and different kinds of knowledge that they would like to share on the subject. And this is going to go until a little after 11:30, so we'll set aside a little more than a half hour for this. And then in our final session, we're going to pass the torch over to John Cameron, who's going to ask our panelists to kind of reflect on what they've heard, and make their kind of closing comments in a couple of minutes. The only real rules we have here, we ask everybody to just not be a jerk, we've all heard all the horror stories, so please don't be a jerk. If you want to be a jerk, go be a jerk elsewhere. There's so many other places you can do that. If you can keep your cameras and your microphones on mute, cameras off, microphones on mute, unless you're speaking or unless you are one of the panelists, that would be really helpful, because then in case somebody decides to be a jerk, it'll be easier for us to just kick them out. We are hoping to have a very vibrant conversation in the chat. So please, follow along, make comments, pose questions in the chat as we go through it. And we're going to try and speak from those questions as we have our conversation as well. In the second session, please use the raise hand button if you want to speak. And like I said before, we're asking that QT BIPOC youth step forward for this and others step back as appropriate. And the last thing is that we are recording the session. So just know if you turn your camera on and pose a question, then you will likely be caught in the image. So that is it. So let's kick it off. We are actually 1 minute ahead of schedules, which very much pleases me. So, talking about public policy advocacy, its relationship to activism is kind of like, it's a bit of a head trip for me anyway. And I thought maybe one way that we could start, I'm going to ask each a question directly to each one of you, and then we're going to pull out on and talk about some broader themes. So I'd like to start with you, please, Elle. You come from a really diverse range of both activism and advocacy in the city and the country. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Black Power Hour and kind of how you're able to convince the prison system to let you work alongside incarcerated people. Like, how did you pull that off?
Well, we didn't. None of the work I do is sanctioned by liked by or supported by the prison system. And I think that's actually really important. Um, I personally don't believe in like taking grants from the government to do anti-state work. They will never, ever, ever support that work, which means you have to work outside the system. Our number is actually blocked in the jail. We have to rotate the number often. The new thing is that they tune the TVs to the same frequency because they have to choose a audio frequency to put the TVs on, the main TVs on the range, and they'll put that on 95.7 so that people can't hear CKDU and hear the show. So I've heard many reports of that. Um, and then just to pause here, because I don't want to totalize this thing, because on the other hand, I've called Renus, like, you know, when I was calling Randy and Renus to like set up a visit or something, and some of the guards will be like, oh, I love your work, you know, so it depends on the person. Although also the degree to which you can take that seriously, like often a system will tell you, oh no, we love you, while they're working behind the scenes to push you out. So none of the work that we do with the prison system is sanctioned by the prison system. Um, and like, I just raised that importantly as well, because for example, if you want to do research on prisoners, you need approval from CSC, from the Correctional Services Canada. So the only research that's getting passed through is research the prison system agrees with. So you can imagine how this skews the very data that we have about prisons. They are never going to let you into a prison to do research on prisoners organizing for labor. You know, like that isn't going to happen. They're not going to let you in to do research on like experiences of racism from the guards or something, you know, like that just isn't going to happen. So even the kind of studies that we have, and in many ways the field of criminology is based upon collusion with the police, with the prison system. And there's criminologists who fight back on this, right? There's a field now, particularly of radical criminologists who particularly engage in this issue and question the category of crime itself. There's a really great essay by Tamari Kotosa called, I can't remember the full title. Part of it is Legibilizing the Herd. But one of the things he talks about is like crime is a fictional category, and criminologists are responsible for reifying, like creating and then pretending these categories really exist and proceeding as though crime is not a projection of the elites, right? So what is defined as criminal and as a crime is very much defined by power. That's why street crime, like robbing Walmart of a bottle of pop, is a crime. And all these corporations that steal our money, the number one theft in the world is employer theft of employee wages, right? But like you can't call the police and be like 911, like my boss just like refused to give me overtime. But that's the biggest theft, right? So we understand that. So all of this is a sort of long answer by way of saying that I actually believe in working outside of the system. I'm not saying everybody has to do that. At least someone has to do it. There's too many people working with the system. You need people outside the system that then aren't beholden to, because the problem if you work with them is then when you do something they don't like, they can kick you out, which happened to me at Nova. I was going into the women's institution and I was accused of illegally counseling the women, which meant asking them about their lives. I was also accused of illegally touching the woman. This is at the same time. So I would hug them after writing workshop. This is the same time as a guard was sexually assaulting the woman in the facility, mind you. So while the women are being raped, like, you can't hug them or say, how was your day? And that just sums up the notion of intimacy in prison, right? Where like they can strip search people in these extremely abusive, violating ways, but you can't say, I love you to somebody, like you can't touch their hand during a visit. So all that system, how do you engage with that system? How do you work with that system? They will always tell you that you're not supposed to be there. They will always find some way to kick you out. And then if your work is based upon their permission, then you're going to not be able to serve. So our work, and this goes to the radio, like they try to stop people from listening, but anyone can call in, anybody can listen. The prison strike was organized through the radio platform because we were talking about Black August in 2018 and just talking about Black liberation. And we had given information about the US prison strike. And then when they heard that, as they recognized and their conditions worsened and they've continued to worsen, they were like, okay, well, we want to do a strike, so that was one of the platforms that allowed that organizing, which is very difficult. Like people in prison are on different ranges. They're not even in the same populations. There's protective custody, there's general custody. Like, they're not talking across to each other, but they could hear through the radio and they could organize. And then people on other ranges were finding out that there was a prison strike from like our coverage of the prison strike, because it started on one range. And then they were like, yeah, we're on strike, So like we were able to use it that way. And I think it's just really important that we carve out those spaces. I'll stop talking because this is a really long answer, but.
Well, no, that's really good. Maybe I could just ask you a quick follow-up then, because then it sounds to me that what's at stake here for you, El, is more about radical journalism and less about integration or finding a way to work within that kind of system. So maybe like in terms of the kinds of coverage, the kinds of voices that you're able to bring out on the radio. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think it's also about trust, that people have to, they know I'm 100% on their side, and I have to be.
Yeah.
And I, like, one thing that bothers people in prison, I understand it from a legal perspective, but people hate when they're in court and the lawyers call each other my friend. That everyone hates that. They're like, you're not supposed to be the friend of the prosecution. Like, you're supposed to be defending me. And the point is, of course, civility, and like they literally are friends. They all went to law school together. But the point is also that you're supposed to like not be at war in the court. But if you're sitting there, the guy's like my friend while this person is wrongfully convicting you, it sends a kind of message. So my perspective is that I'm 100% all in with them. Somebody has to be. I have to advocate for them. They have to trust that I don't have to report to a funder, or somebody can't call me up and be like, I heard that you did this, and then I have to cut off calls or whatever. They know 100% I'm not reporting on them. Like, I'm not taking anything back. And I think that's what's important. It's the relationship. So many people, I mean, most of what I know about prison is because everything I know about prison is because people inside prison took the time to teach me. And many people have disclosed extremely personal things in the course of doing this advocacy because they trust it will stay with me and it won't go anywhere else. So that's what I think the main thing is, that, your commitment, your trust. Do I pick up the phone when they need me to? Am I willing to go all in for them? Like, they know you have to, I think when you choose to do anti-state work, you have to make a sacrifice. And you gain in other ways. I always say that I've never felt as much joy in my life as when Abdul, once we stopped his deportation, when I saw him in Toronto and he hugged me and just lifted me off my feet. And I've never felt that much joy in my life. Like, I go back to that moment and I'm like, the joy that filled me, we were both crying, like the joy that filled me in that moment, like that is irreplaceable. But that means you sacrifice jobs, you sacrifice relationships, you sacrifice, a lot of people, Elle loves murderers, like, just the small indignities. You call the prison and they think you're smuggling contraband, or you're, like trying to sleep with all the prisoners, and you have to kind of put up with that and know that that's circulating about you, and like all those different things. But I don't think that if we're fully committed to this work, we can both want to eat the fruit of the state and then be like, but I'm working against you. Why on earth would they fund anyone to do programs against them? It doesn't make any sense. So with the radio, it just allows us to like have those conversations, have a space where people can call in, people testify in various ways, often on behalf of each other. Like, somebody here is in solitary confinement. There's a woman here without her mattress. This woman's pregnant. She can't go to the doctor. This guy has a heart bleed. So people will often advocate for other people, and it's because they know that there's a space. Even like when we meet music requests, which has always been the biggest source of tension on the show, has been our music choices, that we play hip hop.
Wow, really?
Oh my God, I don't want to hear the N-word, that's always the biggest force of complaint is always the music and the profanity in the music. And I'm always like, you understand that people are in solitary confinement that are calling for those requests. That is the obscenity, right? But the point of the request that people always didn't understand is because if you're sitting in jail and somebody will meet a request for you, that is something you do not have. You cannot ask a jail for something and get it met. Like, maybe 10 weeks down the line, like, you're like, oh, my tooth is falling out of my mouth, and 6 months later the dentist will come, and at that time your jaw is like rotted, like that's the experience of jail. Versus if you can say, I just want to hear the song, and somebody will play it for you. So we always just played whatever music, like didn't even bleep it, and that was our biggest thing that people got mad at us about. But I think the importance there was, again, just knowing that like you can have agency in a space. So that's our main point. Like, you have agency on this space, you guide us, you're an equal partner. We have to not allow the prison thing where like you're lesser and you have to account for yourself in all these different ways. Like, we're not playing parole officer here. So what the radio does is just, allow that equal space, a space of freedom, and then move from there.
I love it. Thank you very much for that. Lisa, I want to turn to you a little bit because I know in addition to being a politician, you also have a background in journalism as well with the CBC. So I was wondering, like, is there anything that you would like to follow up on what Elle had shared with us? And then my question for you is, how do you actually lobby a politician? Like, how do you functionally do that? Do you call them? Do you stage a protest? Like, I think everybody would benefit from knowing what is useful in terms of how you go about trying to raise an issue with a politician.
So I'll answer the second part of the question, which is quite a bit more tactile and sort of put in a boxable, put in an answerable. But I just want to first just really appreciate Elle, and appreciate what I've come to understand, which is that, you know, activism and voices, you know, like L's, like Women's Wellness Within, you know, all the different folks organizing for defunding the police, what they do is they expand the conversation, like they expand the public conversation so that there is an expanded universe of possibilities that ultimately politicians and then public servants can consider, I guess. And then I really see, you know, policy lobbying. First of all, I'll say that one of the things that has sort of surprised me, and surprised me because I'm naive, and I have this chronic naivete problem. You know, a lot of lobbying that happens in government is actually behind closed doors, through phone calls, amongst people with relatively great means and longstanding relationships with people inside government, be they politicians or bureaucrats. So, you know, one of my great frustrations as an elected MLA, and I wrote about this in a blog post that's on my website, is that I'm sure that Michel Samson has continued to have far more influence in this government as a former MLA because he's a lobbyist, you know, working for a law firm, and one of his clients was the folks who wanted to buy Owl's Head, which, you know, had been considered a protected area for decades already. Than I do as an MLA serving my democratic function. You know, we don't sit in the legislature a lot, and there's a lot of different layers between my words and government action. But that said, you know, when people are looking to make positive policy changes, I think the biggest advice that I have is to not just identify the problem, but also identify steps of the solution. Because in the same way that I'm, you know, struggling and frankly, you know, never getting on top of all the critic areas that I am covering as a spokesperson, you know, in the same way, often, you know, I don't have full insight into what it is like inside government departments because I haven't been there. I've been an opposition politician, but I appreciate that there are many different attentions and many different things drawing people in different directions. There's lots of friction to positive policy change, and so I think that it's a lost opportunity when be it organizations or individuals connect with a politician and talk about the problem. And if they, it's not that they can't just talk about the problem, but it's really powerful when they also talk about a solution. This is what would make a difference. And I think about a couple like small successes that I've had. I mean, one that's quite small but significant at the level of personal lives is that you know, through conversations with somebody who works a lot with people who are experiencing homelessness in Halifax, I found out that Metro Regional Housing would not consider an applicant, any applicant for tenancy if that person had arrears from a previous tenancy with a regional housing authority in Nova Scotia. And so there were cases where people were living in homeless shelters who had been a tenant of a regional housing authority at another point in their life when maybe they were in a situation that involved domestic violence, maybe 20 years earlier, and now that person is like stable and working with a housing support worker and wants to go into regional housing, into like public housing, and they would absolutely be point blank denied because of an arrears attached to them for years earlier. And we've been able to change that. But I was super grateful to the people working on the front lines because they were able to narrow something down enough that I was able to really clearly articulate what a problem and what a solution was. So I guess that's what I would say. I mean, one time I was in a meeting with a former, maybe he was a deputy minister, I don't even know, but he worked at a bunch of different levels in provincial government, and also he was in municipal government as kind of a consultant when I met him. And he described this moment where a bunch of people were able to get several deputy ministers in a room, and You know, like that's like a
That's a
pretty,
powerful group.
it's a pretty powerful group. And he's like, and they didn't have an ask. They
Oh,
wanted to talk about the problem,
uh,
but they didn't have an ask.
right.
And basically by the time you get people like that in the room, they're already convinced that there's enough of a problem that they're arriving kind of somewhat disposed to try to implement something. They're giving you the time and therefore they want to hear, so what's the answer?
Right.
Or what's an answer? Because it's never going to be complete.
Sure.
And they didn't have an ask. So I always remember that story,
Hmm.
that I want to counsel people well so that they don't squander those opportunities if we're able to get them for them.
I think that's really important guidance, actually. So, in a way, would you say it's accurate, if I'm paraphrasing you here, to you can think about finding a politician that you can work with, and then because you can't work with all of them, and then that person can serve as a bit of a conduit, because gathering for those of you who don't know, the deputy minister is basically the head of the bureaucracy, the people who actually lead the policy changes in the permanent government. So it's not an elected position. So to have that level of decision maker is really a big thing. So the MLA in this case can help set up those kind of opportunities when the solutions are something that can come up to the table. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a couple different cases, I've been able to connect, and it's not always with the deputy minister. That's fairly rare. But I think of a recent meeting where I was able to have like several kind of executive director level folks meet with a community organization, and I try to work with them to prepare them for the meeting so that they're showing up both with the analysis of the problem, but also like what are you asking for? What are you asking for in terms of money, in terms of policy change, in terms of ongoing relationship? So that, yeah. I mean, again, another example I think of is the No One Is Illegal campaign, which, um, you know, MLAs and MPs and I imagine possibly municipal politicians heard from this. Well, in the context of the pandemic, though, that campaign has been going on for a long time. And, one of the challenges initially as a provincial politician, and I'm the spokesperson for the caucus on immigration as well as on agriculture. So I had an interest, but initially it was hard to figure out what was in a provincial jurisdiction that we could ask for. And it was actually in a subsequent conversation with some representatives from the Federation of Agriculture that I heard about the lack of MSI coverage
Mhm.
for those workers. And that happened to tie in with some other things that we were hearing from the refugee clinic and from private immigration lawyers, that actually there's all kinds of people in our community that are long-term residents of Nova Scotia that are not being covered by MSI, by health coverage. And in the context of a pandemic, but also actually in any context,
Right.
that is detrimental both to their health and to our health, because our health is like interdependent with folks in our community. And so that resulted in a proposal that we would have introduced in the fall legislative session had it happened. But by interfacing with some progressive immigration lawyers who we know, really getting the language in, like, how can we actually de-link health coverage from immigration status? Let's link health coverage to residency, not to immigration status. And again, it's like getting it to a point where you're like, okay, I know there's a problem, and here's like a part of the solution.
Hmm. No, I got you. Thanks for that. And I think this is a very logical place to bring you in, Christine, in terms of thinking, because you spent an awful lot of time thinking about the solution to policy problems. So I guess the question I'd like to kick off with you is, as a director of research for the CCPA here for a long time, you've seen lots of ups and downs in terms of, I know for a fact you've been bringing lots of really good policy alternatives to the table, and they don't always get picked up. So I'm wondering, like, how do you use research skills in order to influence public policy in a progressive way in your capacity as a researcher?
Sure, thanks, Ajay, and thanks for the invitation. Since I guess last week or a couple weeks ago, I've been thinking a lot about not just my work at CCPA, but all the various advocacy work that I've been doing. So I'm gonna come at this from what you're asking me around research, but I've learned a lot of lessons over the years from asking the state to fund midwifery to trying to do things like have women in politics become a major field of study at York University, to advocating to change social assistance through the Benefits Reform Action Group, to trying to change the status of women as the co-chair of the Women's Action Alliance for Change Nova Scotia. Over the years, I've certainly, and also, and this is not an also, but you probably don't know this, but my dissertation was about this question. It was, what are the role of experts in evidence? Who gets to be an expert, and what evidence is used and should be used in the public policy process? And I specifically focused on gender-based analysis. And when I was writing, it was something fairly foreign in the sense of policymaking, but of course, feminists have been doing it forever. And the role of nurses in reforming the healthcare system. And I can certainly talk about that, but one of the lessons that I drew out of that work was that I think it's partially what Ella is speaking to, but for nurses, it was a decision to undervalue the differences that they bring in a very gendered profession, in doing work that is caring work that's very undervalued in our society, and attempting to be recognized as experts and bringing forward evidence around how we could kind of reform the healthcare system, but without being able to kind of challenge the very box in which they were sitting in. So this was a time in the 80s, in the late 80s, when we were looking at what could primary healthcare look like. And we know that I mean, nursing has been transformed away from, I'd argue, relational caregiving to how much time do you need to spend at, and we see these kind of conversations coming out at the long-term care in particular, right? So I think some of the lessons for me is those questions. I mean, midwifery is publicly funded, but I think one of the issues is, as we moved forward, is many of the things that Ella's saying, it also takes the kind of sustained focus. If you're asking the state to do something, you need to be continually advocating for when that's implemented, how that's implemented, who continually has a voice at those tables. We still have many, many, many communities across the province that don't have access. We don't have African Nova Scotia midwives who were doing midwifery before the state came in. And so many lessons to be learned, but I will come back to CCPA and research. And I'd say this, one of the mandates of CCPA is about democratizing the public policy process. It's about opening it up so that we have more voices that can have influence. And so when I think about policy advocacy, it is one tool for activism, but I think we have to step back and think about what's our theory of change and what we're trying to do. Somebody was asking me the other day, what's the difference between a lobbyist and a policy advocate? And I'd say there's a huge difference. I actually do not call what we do lobbying. People write books about this, about lobbying, about, telling a compelling story to a politician. Mr. Irving is not telling a compelling story. Lots of people are getting things on the policy agenda because they reinforce the status quo. So what are you looking to change, and how you're going to bring about that change in the sense of what I think we're talking about today, which is challenging the status quo, requires that activism. It requires that grassroots support. It requires building that solidarity. And what CCPA brings is that little piece of it. It's the evidence. We've been in neoliberalism now for 40 years? I don't even know. And the constant bombardment of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So you're living in poverty. Well, that's your fault. Oh, you have health issues. Well, eat healthier. Oh, you're hungry. Well, let me give you a little food kit and teach you how to cook. The minimum wage will go up. And guess what? You won't gain anything because prices will go up. And it's a constant bombardment of ideas that very much support the status quo. And I don't I'm not saying all this to blame people because we don't hear what CCPA does, which is constantly trying to break through the dominant discourse and make sure that people understand what the alternatives are. Countering the claims that are out there while also bringing forward. So here's what I'd say. Those of us who are trying to push against the status quo have to bring way more evidence, and the evidence is just a small part of how that change will happen, but we still have to do it. Unlike those who are advocating against the increase to the minimum wage, who can ad nauseum repeat the same things. Let me see. We raise the minimum wage and there will be job cuts, raise the minimum wage and price will go up. There's now mounds and mounds of evidence to counter those claims. And yet you can continually just repeat them without any evidence. Whereas if I advocate for policy change and support those who are fighting for 15, we need all the other evidence. We need the evidence that not only says that this will help workers and it's the right thing to do, we need the evidence that shows that this is, this is bottom-up growth. This will also help our employers. This will do everything and more,
Right.
to just be heard. And I guess when I think about the work that we do around ending poverty, which is ultimately where we want to move to, I remember when an economist, Angela McEwen, came to us in 2009 and said, we need to cost poverty. And I was like, what do you mean we need to cost poverty? Like, we need to end poverty because it's the right thing to do because we have the resources to do it.
Right.
So now I have to cost it. So we've done all the things to provide the evidence. So that's not part of the excuse that politicians can use for not acting on what we're asking for. And it's not that we have to ask for it, it's that we have to demand it, and we need to build the solidarity. And I think that's around that power shifting that we need to talk more about, right?
Yeah.
One of the real problems of neoliberalism in our current context is it's really hard to connect the dots to who's benefiting from the current system and who's paying the costs. And I think that's what CCPA brings to the table, is really constantly asking those questions and trying to get the answers, which is not always easy. Nova Scotia has a very closed political culture with very deep partisan politics, especially for those parties that obviously have been in power for hundreds of years, that it's very hard to break through. And then there's this other layer of, I'd call it, I don't even know, polite nicety Nova Scotia politics, where I think Al speaks to that and knows more than I do what it feels like to be to be called I don't even know, troublemaker, whatever it is that we're called, because we're constantly pushing against the status quo. And I only do it, I don't do it in the ways that Elle does, that really opens up that whole part of the Nova Scotia culture that really doesn't value advocacy. I'll just say that. I started working in this stuff as an academic initially, and this goes back to like Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And sorry, Elle, you said something about, advocacy can't be funded by the state. I actually would like to get to a place where we recognize that advocacy can be funded somehow, still independent. Because I think we should be paid for the work that we do, which is critical to a healthy democracy. But I remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau saying, there used to be core funding for women's groups. And he said, oh, well, women's interests are narrow self-interest. They're no different than the lobbyists on the business side. We're not going to fund that anymore. And advocacy became a really, really bad word in Canada. And I think we're still there around that. But to me, this is about opening up the democracy question around how are decisions that are made at that level that affect us every day, how do we get to a place where we open that up? And it's not about voting every 4 years. What is it? And
if I could interject
there.
there.
Sorry, Ajay, I'm just
no problem
ranting.
It strikes me though that there are other countries in the world that do fund this kind of work, and it's interesting thinking about it from an international development perspective, because oftentimes donors and other states demand that civil society organizations be given independent funding, and they make that a condition. So it's interesting to me that a place like Canada that systematically fails so much of its population, despite having the resources, are not expected to do these kinds of things that we ask many developing countries to do in order to be eligible for inclusion into, international organizations. I wanted to follow up because we're getting some chatter now in the chat, and maybe kind of direct some of this. And Elle, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off here, because you were talking about the importance of working outside of the system. Aparna asked us a question here about countering neoliberal discourse, and from what I heard from Christine and Lisa, I got a really good description of understanding how different structures and institutions operate in order to weigh in on them. So Elle, maybe you could start us off by asking about or answering this question of should activists be working with advocates? Are they the same people, or is it really important for these two groups to be separate? Oh, I think you're muted, Elle. Sorry.
I mean, activism is advocacy. So, I mean, I'm not sure where we're on that definition, because those are sort of personal definitions. I would personally probably draw the line at what is activism much tighter than a lot of people do. And then I think advocacy is when you're working with people to, witness for them, to testify for them, and to work with them, preferably not on their behalf, but with them. But those are different definitions. I want to take the neoliberalism question. Yeah, I think part of neoliberalism, so I'll just go back to neoliberalism 101. So obviously it's a set of policies and practices like austerity budgets, privatizing public services, and that comes along with a rhetoric of there's only so much money to go around. This is the individualizing, like pull up your bootstraps, but it's also an ideology. It's not just a practice. And in particular with the ideology, it's about transporting from the business world into the everyday world the beliefs and systems of businesses and corporations, right? So the belief that efficiency is a value in itself, which corporations are not actually efficient, but this is the myth. Like, we need Walmart because they'll get you that good quicker than the government can, or whatever, right? And then that value that doesn't even belong to the corporation becomes an imposed value on the rest of society. So Christine was talking about this with nursing, right? That it becomes like not what is your quality of care, but if you spend 3 minutes with each patient, then we can get through the whole ward with less nurses, right? Wherever we see that, hotels, where now the reason why check-in time keeps going later and later is because they keep cutting the cleaning staff and then expecting them to do like, an entire floor of rooms by themselves. So now we can't check until 4 p.m. because they're not paying cleaning staff to get the rooms clean, right? So wherever we look, this is happening. This is, of course, what brings Trump to power, right? Like, partially because people are like, well, he's a businessman and he can make a deal. And like, if the top best billionaire CEO, obviously that should be the leader of the country, right? So part of neoliberalism is we start to adopt these ideas. We start to brand ourselves and believe that our job is to do PR. And you see this all over the place. Go to the police board. When they talk about like police complaints, they're not like, maybe we should stop the police from fucking killing people and like beating people. They're like, we need a more efficient complaint system. So has anybody reviewed the communication policy? And you're like, that has nothing to do with it. Like, why don't you like actually just defund the police and stop them from fucking beating people? Like, why don't we just do that, But no, we're going to talk about a more efficient online platform. Like, this is like neoliberalism, right? So, and we all get caught up in it. This idea that, we do PR. This happens in activism, right? That people spend much more time hustling their activism than actually doing the work of activism, because it's, if you say and present a notion of the activist, that's actually more successful and important than all the grimy on the ground, like daily work that you can't even talk about, right? So, but with that said, just to give people that framework, I think part of the problem, and I think what we're consumed by right now, I would suggest, is a culture of nihilism. You see this across the left and the right. In the right, it's stuff like QAnon, right? Like, I don't know that I can really make an impact on this world, and I feel, like economically stressed or whatever. So I'm just going to retreat to like mystical numbers, right? Like, if I can count, the words in Donald Trump's speech, and the 17th word was this. So, like all of that. And on the left, it's stuff like a lot of the kind of superficial organizing that happens on the left. Like, it's all over the place, it's across the spectrum, because people have suffered after like almost 50 years now of neoliberalism and feel like the system is totalizing and there's nothing you can do and you despair. So you're like, I can't get rid of the prison, but I can, over here be mad at like this commercial by Pepsi or something. You know what I mean? Like this is kind of what's encouraged. And so I think it's really important that we understand that, yes, you know, neoliberalism is a powerful system. Yes, it's global. Yes, it interlocks in all kinds of ways, like, you know, the prison and white supremacy abroad and imperialism and the wars we make, and yeah, how we're treated in the work, like it's all together, but it is not unbreakable. And I think our mistake right now is we talk so much about the neoliberal system that we don't present the idea that there's a way out of it. That there's other things you can do. So then you start to feel like, well, how do you fight a deportation? Like the Canadian government is all powerful. It can do what it wants. You know, the prison can do what they want. Like the university is going to do what they want. And like, you don't feel that you have an inroad. So I think it's really important for us to understand that there's all kinds of cracks. There's all kinds of pressure points. There's all kinds of ways we can organize. And we have done it and we do it. Number one is like, you can outwork them. Like when we were doing the Abdul thing, we were working, I mean, literally I would look at our phone calls and we were going to bed at 3 a.m, waking up at 6, you know, while we did our jobs and just working, whatever we were doing. And there was a point at Parliament Hill where someone told me that as people were sitting up, they're so stressed about this, like, how are they like fucking with us constantly? And they're like, you can't outwork them. Like they're a machine, like they're just going to work. And we worked and we were willing to sacrifice. We literally had conversations about, what are we going to do? Are we, if he gets deported, will we drain our bank accounts? Like, will we fly to Somalia ourselves and like support, you know, will we lie down on the runway? Will we get on the plane and buy plane tickets and stand up so it can't take off? And when those answers were yes, from those of us who were doing the core, then we knew that what we were requiring of each other. And of course, this is led by his sister Fatuma, who doesn't even have citizenship and is being threatened with deportation herself and going all in for her brother, right? So once we made that decision as a group and we understood that we were going to go all in, it was easy in that sense. We knew we were just going to work hard. And we did. Ben did in court. We did on the streets. Fatuma did. And like, we won that case. So we didn't believe in this idea that you can't stop a deportation in Canada. Ben didn't believe in the idea of there's no point in going to federal court. So everybody did what we could do to our max and we were successful. So I think that, yeah, it's understanding that you can. And again, I think the biggest threat to neoliberalism is building solidarities. I think that is the threat. Like, and that means that we have to be willing to be in coalition. That means we have to be willing to compromise in various ways. An example I always give is in the prison movement, the anti-prison movement. There's people that come into it that are just like hardcore abolitionists, like, you know, you have a political philosophy or an abolitionist, you got it. There's obviously like Indigenous and Black people that come in from a like position of understanding race and the containment and discipline of Black and Indigenous bodies. And then you have a group of people who come in because like their sister died in prison or their brother was beaten up or something, you know? And many of them will, you know, these are like often white people that are like, I had no questions about the system. They told me like, oh, you know, your son will get help in there. And I was like, yeah, okay, you'll get help in there. And then he died. He was killed by the guards. And at that point, and then I experienced the cover up, and then I experienced the corruption. And then but a lot of them don't have necessarily like a racial analysis, a political analysis. They've experienced this trauma. And as we work together, there's points of tension. There are people that will be like, well, my kid was white and they died. So why are we talking about like Indigenous people? Or, you know, like, why are we talking about race? Or I don't think this is about power. And we have to have those conversations with each other. And we're not in a situation where you can just be like, go learn, go Google it. Like, fuck you. Like, no, we're working together. And so we have to have the patience with each other to see each other and all of us. And like, they have things to teach me. I have things to teach, you know, like I don't have that experience of having a loved one die in prison. So it is like, I need to listen to that and understand where they're coming from. And they need to understand other things. And we work together and we build that understanding. And that is actually the work that we need to do against neoliberalism, when we are humanizing each other, when we are working together, when we are like strategically working with each other. And then, yeah, you have people from like, you know, small town white Ontario working with people from, you know, the North, working with people who are like Black radical activists. And we do that together. So I think that that's really, really important. Working in coalition is not beloved these days. I think a lot of people don't do a lot of coalition work. I actually think everyone should spend some time doing it, if only to like learn that it's fucked up. Like, well, I mean, not for everybody, right? Like, you want to figure out your work style. Like, sometimes you're like, yeah, I do best working by myself. But I think everyone should spend some time doing it, like with an organization or something, just because it does teach you things about strategy, tactics, how to communicate, how to deal with conflict, how to make mistakes and like account for them. Like, I think those things are actually important. So, and I think that work is very much anti-neoliberal work. So yeah.
No, I love this. I love that solidarity becomes, in some sense, the solution to the like dehumanizing alienation of neoliberalism. And you're so right. that you can't accept the inevitability that the state wants to present you with, that all these various institutions want to present you with. I want to give Lisa a chance to come in here, so you can feel free to, Lisa, say whatever you like there. Or I was thinking about, in the last kind of 10 minutes we have here in this session, to ask each one of the three of you to maybe talk about like a mistake or two that you made in your earlier days, things that you wish that you had known 10 years ago, or what have you, for those who are 10 years before. So would you like to kick us off there, Lisa, and then I'll move through?
Sure. I mean, it's funny when I think about mistakes. So I graduated from Dell and IDS in 95. And I actually just started getting involved in some activist, volunteer run things of various sorts. And I used to joke that I led various organizations to their demise. And that was sort of how I became a journalist. And then I stewed for 15 years in journalism, and at a certain point was always telling stories about people, or seeking often to tell stories about people who I admired, and kind of would leave the story sort of feeling a little bit wistful that I couldn't work with them, or that I wasn't one of them. And that's sort of what led me into politics, in an indirect way. So yeah, I think, when I think back to those experiences in my 20s, certainly I made the mistake of thinking that, of undervaluing the relationship building, of undervaluing that working with, like that. I think I didn't have the skills at the time to not take up too much space. I didn't have the skills to really you know create create spaces, or help facilitate spaces where a lot of different voices could be heard, and people would feel and have an experience of their own power to make change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like just working hard, and feeling like that would somehow, accomplish the goal. And yeah, and it didn't. So, and I was like deeply humbled, slash humiliated on a couple in a couple of experiences. And I think that was, probably healthy and formative for me. Yeah. And just to go back for a second to the neoliberalism conversation, I think a lot now about the cost of wealth, about like how our deeply unequal society and world, and how the abundance that people have is actually like causing a cost for the rest of us and for the planet. And yeah, that that tackling that inequality is, it's both for justice, but it's also for like just viability of our continued presence on the planet. um and also I think um about what, I guess, what real joy and what real love feels like, and which is something like I've experienced certainly more as I've gotten older. And that is, uh I think an experience that many people are denied, and that you cannot buy. And I had a conversation fairly recently with a landlord who is not a great landlord. And it was sort of an interesting window into a different world. Um, and at some point, he was talking about how he just wanted to make more money. And I was like, your money cannot buy you security. Like like we're at a point on the planet and in our society where, I think uh money can and does certainly give people certain advantages, but you cannot. The only way to security is to actually have everybody be okay. Like that is the only way is to actually share. I mean, that is our history of sort of human civilization, is that we have the power to cooperate, and 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 really the ultimate inefficiency is billionaires. That's the ultimate inefficiency. So anyhow, that's kind of
you're
a ranty
absolutely right.
thought.
And I think that's such a good point too. I know you have a background in econ, but like the mythology of Homo economicus, right? The idea that human nature is all about, self-interest. Like nothing could be further from the truth if you actually look at the empirical history of human civilization. Now, thanks for that, Christine. I want to give you an opportunity too to weigh in on some of this in a couple minutes. What are some of the things that you wish that you knew 10, 15 years ago?
Well, many things, and still constantly learning, obviously. But I'm actually going to talk a bit more about midwifery because I think it's a really good example of things that I learned. So I was involved with the Midwifery Coalition for, I want to say, a decade. I became involved as a researcher. So I was a paid staff at the Atlantic Center of Excellence for Women's Health, and I created a program where we would do research on midwifery. But I also then was involved in the advocacy organization. And our goal was to have midwifery publicly funded. And we did reach that goal. We fought them on, we need a pilot project. Pilot projects are complete political footballs. Don't ever fall for a pilot project. We fought them on many fronts, but I think one of the things I've learned out of the midwifery advocacy was that we needed to really forefront why midwifery was the practice that it was and why it was so powerful for women. So I came to midwifery because of the center of midwifery is about informed choice. Sorry, this is a roundabout way of saying, but I mean, informed choice is a really critical notion that we often don't talk about. If you go to your family physician, it's about, you got to say yes. You can't even say no to anything, especially if you're a pregnant person these days. There's so many decisions where you're just expected to agree. But also that midwifery was a social movement. It was very much embedded in a movement to challenge the medicalization of women's health. And as we advocated on funding it and midwifery became a professional organization, government didn't move to fund it because of the reasons why midwifery was powerful in the way that it was, but also why midwifery was marginalized. So on almost all women profession that approached their care very much with women-centered, family-centered, I'd say, the historical context of why the inequities existed, and then you add midwifery into a system that has all of the problems that the healthcare system has. I'm not saying as advocates we can change all of that, but I think one of my real big learnings over all the years is you got to know what the principles are upon which you're trying to reach something, but what your non-negotiables are. I think Ella is speaking to that as well, and that's kind of one of my learnings is you do have to step out. You do have to make a decision at one point that says, so I've been at government tables and I refuse to do that work anymore. The meeting with bureaucrats, I refuse to give them a reason to say that they're consulting when there's no meaningful open policy process that happens in this province. Right. You have to make a decision about stepping out of things and then raising your voice in different ways and saying that the process is flawed or whatever the issue is. So I think those are some of my cautions and learnings around that work. I mean, on the one hand, it's publicly funded and for sure there are more families that get access to midwifery, but it did lose some of its power in terms of that historic, and not even historic, but how midwives were practicing outside the system. I mean, when I moved to Nova Scotia, I had midwifery care outside of the system. And part of why midwifery moved is also, I just want to say this, people by their nature are scared of change. And I think we have to understand why that is, right? It's about insecurity. And it's also that neoliberalism has fed this.
Right.
It has fed it by like making us all exhausted and running in place and trying to get at the little crumbs that are left instead of really figuring out
We're expected to be grateful for crumbs.
Who's running away with the cake while we're all out here saying that, that unionized worker has a pension, and that like all of the ways that we've been divided against each other. And so I would agree, it is solidarity. There's no way around kind of what we need to break through neoliberalism. It's solidarity. It's figuring out what our non-negotiables are and what those principles are upon which we want to move that forward. And so my last thing is, to be very cautious, and that's part of the working in coalitions, is that whole idea that we come to a consensus, that we can get beyond politics. Let's be very clear on who has power, whether the consensus is squashing what are often the least powerful voices at the table, and how we actually really need to be cautious about that. And I raise that because I hear it a lot. I hear it a lot around the climate crisis. I hear it a lot around other issues, but that one in particular. And we need to be very clear on why we are in the place we are in terms of the climate crisis. Who is to blame for that, and how we move forward to ensure that those who have really borne the price are not the same people who bear the costs, and those who are to blame are not those who benefit from the solutions. And I think that's partially what the pandemic has shown us, and hopefully has opened a few more eyes to what's really happening. So let's stop saying things like prices go up. There's no magic in the economy. Businesses choose to put prices up. Let's be very clear on who and what, and stop talking about things in these magical economic ways. And I think it's a big part of the blame is economics and the way that it presents our economy.
Really good point. We're running a little over time, but I want to give Elle a couple of minutes to answer the same question, if you could.
Really quickly, I think, they also tell us we get more conservative with age. I've certainly got more radical. And I think that's just because, even like 10 years ago, I still thought people might hire me and let me be in the system and let me have a good life. And since they didn't want to, I figured out how to survive and live without that. And the irony being that now, because of the summer, suddenly now people are like, oh, like maybe we should hire people who care about, and I'm like, but I've been here for like 15 years and you guys literally threw me in the gutter and the trash. And now you're like, oh, interesting points, So I say that to be like, I think the most important thing you have to do is learn how to own your actions, take the consequences for those things, and understand that there are something that I think one of the things people are trying to do now is live like dual lives. Like, you want to be an activist in the streets, but you want to have a big house in the end. And I'm like, those two things don't work. Like, you have to, like pick what your commitments are. And these kind of old school words are really important. Commitment, duty, responsibility, ethics, integrity. Those are the things you have to have a conversation with yourself about. And they look different for everybody. What my kind of line is for won't be the same as the person sitting next to me, but you have to like be clear in yourself what those values are, and then what you can and can't have when you live up to those values. So I think I'd probably waste less time in like, despairing over like Dow not wanting to hire me for anything. Like, they were never going to. They hate me. They hate the people I stand for. They hate everything I do. And that's fine. And I'm going to have to figure out how to live a life without that. So I think that's really important. Just like being very clear on your path and your choices and your willingness to make them. I think the second thing is like your comrades. And this goes to the hope thing too. I'm very lucky that, the people that I'm closest to, people that really go to the wall for each other, and we like really, really are loyal to each other. Sometimes to the point of like, probably we shouldn't be, but like, we really are loyal people. And we know that like, because we've been through so much together, fighting all these battles, like there's a tremendous love that is welded into that. And that goes to people you work with as well, you know, that you can't walk step by step with someone like Fatuma and not share an amazing and like that love that comes from working through oppression together, I think is a powerful thing. So I think people, and this goes to the hope question that's being asked, that the work is not the stress. The work is where you are refreshed. The work is the love. The work is where you're actually being active and putting your energy forth and doing something. And sometimes those things fail, but you can still be like, I worked. The stress is like all the stuff around it, like the people talking around you, like the paperwork, you know, the whatever. So I actually think that people think the work is the stress and like, oh, that must be so stressful. I'm like, it's not the work at all. The work is where you go to, like, that's where you're in your fullest self. So as it has been said in the chat, the hope is in action. The hope is in like putting your energy forward. Like every day that you can get up and do something is a hopeful thing. And the other thing I'd say is politics is the art of doing things in public. So don't, as Christine also said, like I'm an evangelical for like the meeting ethic. Don't take private meetings. Like if you are taking them, get the notes out to people. This is like my biggest issue, that this happens all the time, that organizations or people are like, oh, I met with the minister of immigration or whatever. I'm like, well, why don't we know about it? And why don't we know what happened in the meeting? And this happens over and over and over again, that people take all these meetings, and then we don't know the meeting's being taken. Then I'm having conversations like, oh, I was in a meeting about this with like 20 organizations. Like, why did nobody tell anybody that's working on the ground? So let's not do that. That we do not get power from proximity to white supremacy. We do not get power from our ability to sit at the table. That is not where power comes from. That is what they want to teach us that power comes from, so that we're like, I'm special. I'm one of the 10 people that got to be in the meeting with XYZ. That is not special. It is important. Our power is collective. So every move we make, if we feel like we need to take a meeting, then tell people, I'm taking this meeting. What do you want me to say in it? And afterwards, I will report back and we will discuss what happened in the meeting. So that's, I guess, my biggest thing right now. And like, if I can teach people something, do not get caught up in the meeting. Like, don't get caught up in it. They will always offer you a meeting. That was one thing we were able to help with the people from Edmonton, who did an amazing job when they were fighting a deportation on Elmi. But one of the things that had happened to them is they were told, meet with your MP, and they were wasting time. Like, not because they weren't working hard, not because they weren't committed, but because people had given them this advice, and they're sitting with this liberal MP, and it's like, oh, wait 2 weeks, I'll get back to you. They wait the 2 weeks, no getting back. They ask, now it's 2 weeks. Now you've lost a month of advocacy time. And one thing we were able to help them with is like, nah, it's an election year. Like, get out there and crash people's shit, you know, direct action. So I really, really, really believe in that. Do it in public. When we were doing the defunding stuff and we weren't sure if we should do it, and this was a group conversation, we press released like our correspondence, because we're like, we're not doing anything secretly. So, I mean, nobody cares what email I sent the chair of the board, but we put it out there so that if anybody ever says, well, you took it, you're like, no, I didn't. Like, here it is public. And if you have questions about it, you can ask me. And I think that's really, really important, that we cannot demand accountability and transparency and ethics and things from other people if we do not put ourselves in that place first. So as we move forward as activists, I think the most important lesson is that, like, is it about self, like what you want for yourself, or is it about our collectivity? And learning to do that is actually a really hard process, because it means stepping down and stepping back and not getting everything you want and all of that. But the rewards for that are where the hope is, that when when we built together as groups. So I just always advocate like true collectivity. Lynn Jones is just a advocate of this, right? Like everything in community, everything to community, everything from community, everything taken back to community, everything origin. That's why she's so successful, because everything she does is never based in her. It's always based in something beyond her. And when you have that, then when the hard times come and like people are shitting on you and you feel despairing, then you have people to go to, and that's what organization is. It's not for the good times. Organization is for the dry times. We didn't need organization this summer as much, when like you didn't have to breathe to be on the news to talk about police. We need it now that no one's talking about it. Where is our organization now to get us through this period into our next period? So organize, 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 as Kwame Ture told us. And that's also how you build hope.
I love it. Thank you, Elle, for that. So we're going to move now quickly into the next session that Fatima will be running, and talking about stepping up and stepping back. This is the time for that. So Fatima, I'm going to just hand it over to you and sign off here for the time being.
Okay, thanks so much for everything so far, and for everyone being here and our lovely speakers. The session's still going on. So what we're doing right now is we're gonna kind of shift to kind of like a community plenary type of session, where we're gonna prioritize BIPOC voices, also queer trans voices in this call, to kind of talk about your experiences that you're comfortable sharing, but also like your knowledge on this topic, because I think it's really important that we, you know, just as we heard from our lovely speakers, I'm sure there's things that folks can say from this audience that even the speakers can learn from, but also, you know, like expand perspectives on different things. So I guess quickly some community standards for that would be, you know, try to use I statements when speaking of your own experience. Take care of yourself during the process. If something gets, you know, emotional, it's okay to step away. But also, with that being said, this is a learning space and not a healing space. So if, you know, be mindful of what you're sharing, but if you do need to chat about something traumatic, I can direct you to the right people. So in terms of how this is going to go, I was thinking of just, you know, like opening up the floor. If you want to raise your hand, there's on the bottom of the tab, there's a reaction. So you can raise your hand there, and then you can unmute yourself. You can also open your video if you want. I'm not sure if Dr. Cameron, folks can unmute themselves or we have to do that, but if so, we'll figure it out. But yeah, if folks are a little bit shy, I could probably start as well. But yeah, I just want to open the floor. You can also talk, like incorporate any questions you might have. But yeah, really just to kind of talk about your experience with this whole topic, advocacy, policy, or just kind of like activism, or, you know, what you've learned, you know, shortcomings you've come across, all those types of things, the causes you work with. I'd love to hear them all. I'm sure other folks would as well. So yeah, if anyone is interested in going, you can raise your hand or you can just speak. Oh, yeah. And then I can also talk about some questions in the chat as well. But yeah, I guess I'll open it up first though. I'll give it a moment. Another thing is like,
there's a question in the chat about self-care. I don't know if people want to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, we talk a lot in class about compassion fatigue and activist self-care. I was just wondering, what are some ways you go about that?
Yeah, so in terms of for me, so a lot of what I've been doing over the past 4 years, so I'm in my 4th year right now, and a lot of it has been related to student leadership and like advocacy and activism, specifically for racial justice on campus. And so that's something we talk about a lot, is just like, you know, you get burnout. And sometimes, unfortunately, for much of my degree, things didn't happen soon enough or fast enough. It's really only like this past year, which is really great. But I think it's obviously our circumstances that have finally pushed things through. But, you know, sometimes you come across issues of bureaucracy. You're told, you know, like things take long, or all those things. So in terms of kind of fatigue and self-care, one thing that I actually did a workshop on this over the summer is I'm kind of become less on the whole self-care thing and more on community care, and like, what does community care look like? Because it's really important for a lot of BIPOC communities. Of a lot of folks don't really have the luxury of self-care, and also have some consumerist connotations to it. And so for me, really, it's been community that has really gotten me through a lot of times. And I think I've been able to give community care to folks, which is also another beautiful experience in itself. So what that means is, you know, if someone's having a rough go, offering to bring them a meal, or, you know, holding space. So one thing that we would do on campus is attending events like this, because I always find events like this really like empowering, and it kind of helps charge me up again. But also having close space with your, you know, community and kin. And that's kind of one way. But also another thing that I realized is the work cannot be done when you yourself are not, you know, able to, because of, you know, your capacity and your battery being drained. So I've come to learn that it's okay to step away for a little bit, to take a little bit of a break. And I think communicating your needs and also being vulnerable is something that has helped with like like fatigue and also compassion fatigue. You know, to do this work or in other work as well, we have to kind of put up a front sometimes of, you know, being very strong. And I'm sure, you know, that is, you know, its own thing, but yeah, it's definitely, it's hard, but I think being vulnerable is, and like with the people around you and like really leaning on others when they have capacity has been like really great and helpful. But I see a hand and I will let Chantel speak. Hi, Chantel.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I guess, yeah, I guess it's still morning. Good morning. I have a question, and I'm not sure if I can ask this specifically to anyone, but um, I noticed in a lot of like youth activist spaces, youth, or not necessarily youth, but in my experience, sorry, youth find a lot of power in the platforms that they hold on social media, and and the reach that they can access with that. And we saw a lot of that during like the like uprising of like Black Lives Matter protesting in the summer. But what comes along with that is when we're consuming media, we're kind of adding this like filter or this bias, whether we notice it or not. And then we're putting out whatever we see fit. And what also comes along with that is this like, I guess you could say like, like you could say like performative activism, and just the, yeah, and obviously like there are a lot of like negative things associated with that, and I was wondering if there was like any advice from folks about, yeah, like combating that in the community and just seeing, yeah, I don't know. And I think another thing that like comes with that is like the like connotations of just like gatekeeping in community, and so it like, is social media like truly an effective strategy? Is there a way that we can do it in such a way that like is like we are openly educating, without like kind of informing our bias on these issues? Yeah.
Did you have someone I know you said you were wondering if you
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone in particular would like feel like that they could speak to this more, but yeah, no, I don't really have anyone in particular. But I've just noticed like I've personally noticed this in like youth activist spaces.
Does anyone want to take that away?
Maybe I'll just say a couple of things. You know, and I was really a younger activist during a time, you know, far before social media, and now I use social media, you know, kind of to publicize my words, but not really as an organizing space. What I've noticed in the ways that I have used social media, both in doing kind of community development stuff immediately before I was elected, and even in organizing, which you know, is an important part of being a politician with the NDP, is like we want to grow, and so like I want to engage people to join us and to like play a part. And what I've noticed is that like there's not a whole lot of overlap between the social media engagement and actual engagement. And so social media is great. Um, but I again and again and again am so aware of the power and the impact of a personal invitation. And even though I find it quite hard to like just literally make enough space and time, I try to keep making space and time for one-on-one engagement, and for also, you know, asking others with whom I already have ongoing relationships, can you help me to really engage these folks? Like I've got this, you know, in the last week, I've had like 5 different emails from people who want to meet me for coffee. And well, like I'm up for trying that, or for Zoom chats, but ultimately I literally do not have enough time to invest in really deepening relationships with all these folks. And yet deepening relationships are are where people stick with stuff, and it's where we change, and it's where I think it's where we learn. And so yeah, I think, you know, I have a hard time relating with folks who are primarily doing their activism, and I never know. Like you don't know what is behind a profile with a lot of followers. You don't know what's, you know, what's behind an event that's been shared a bunch of times. But but I think just making sure that you're putting time into real connection is both good for you and for your self care and for like just enlivening yourself and all of that. But it's also I find still what pays much more dividends in terms of sharing the work.
I'll take performative activism, which in some ways does tie into the self-care conversation, because I think the one non-negotiable in any of this is there's no way out of the work. If you want to do this work seriously, then it's work, and sometimes people, the reason why I say this is because the thing that you cannot, like, it's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be hard. And those are things that we have to accept and adjust ourselves to. It doesn't mean we don't care or take breaks or rest within that. But I think sometimes for younger people, it's like the notion that, yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of discipline, right? And you have to build that in yourself, and there's no way around that. And you can't, sometimes you get people sort of using the discourse of self-care to opt out of the work. Like people are like, oh, I'm just like really stressed and I have the capacity. I'm like, that's fine. But then at some point, if you can't do the work with us, like then you need to step away. You can't be part of the team because we're doing this work for 20 hours a day or 16 hours a day or whatever, right? And I think that we have to accept that there is going to be discomfort. There's going to be really hard times. There's going to be things that really challenge you. And that is part of the work. As Fatima said, sorry, I called you Fatima. As Fatima said, like around that, we build the mutual structures of care. Around that, we build the kind of world and community we want to live in. And I say this as well because I think the opposite of performativity is work. And one of the things that's difficult when you're young is that you see a lot of people, that get attention, like you're doing all this work, and then there's attention being given, like somebody gets in the media or somebody, gets a profile. And of course you feel like, wow, like that person did like this one event and they're getting all this praise. And I've been out here organizing on campus or organizing my community and like nobody notices. And that's really hard to deal with, right? Like, and then this is where bad feelings come in. This is where like conflict comes into activist communities and stuff. So I think that yes, it's a very real thing where there's often an inverse relationship between the amount of work you've done and the amount of attention you get. Like if you invest in getting attention, you will more likely get attention. So if you spend most of your time on Instagram and Twitter, like putting pictures of yourself in a t-shirt, you're going to get more attention than somebody who's like working behind the scenes, bringing meals to people. But the thing that you have to hold on to is that you have to build in yourself the value that bringing meals to people is important. And whether or not people notice it, the people that notice it are the people who are getting the meals. And that's where your power comes from. And that's where you have to learn to validate yourself from, right? And so it's very difficult because you have this landscape where there is celebrity activism, where there are people that are making, like when I hear what, like, and these aren't people I dislike, like Angela Davis is like charges $20,000, $25,000 to sit on her couch and give a Zoom, right? Like people in BLM, like the founders make $30,000, $40,000 per talk, to give the same talk that, I'll make 200 for, right? Like, but the point is if you get caught up in that and if you're like, okay, well I just want that, like, that's not what is meaningful, right? That's not what people remember you for when you're gone. That's not how your community will love you. That's not how the people around you. So I think part of self-care too, which counters this performativity, is really you have to balance yourself and focus on who does this mean? Why am I doing this? Am I doing this to get in the media, or am I doing this because there's people that need this work? And am I doing this because it's my duty or responsibility, or it moves me, or it speaks to me? I'm like with media, like one thing you realize if you do enough media. So I'm someone that does get to be in the media, and the reality is half the time they're just bored. Like, they need a story. It's like Friday at noon. If a cat sneezes, it's going to be on the news. Like, it's not that big a deal to be in the media. And I think people get very caught up in this because then you're like, oh, this person got an article. In reality, it just means they know the right person, somebody who's friends with somebody. Like, it doesn't define your worth. So really, really important is defining your worth for yourself and defining your work for yourself, and then valuing that and filling your life with the people who will value you for that. And don't get caught up in this social media world, which is like literally an addictive world of dopamine releasing likes and clicks and shares, and then that gets you caught up. And that is actually what I will contend to you is what is stressful. That is exactly when the work gets stressful, is when it's being shared and then people are talking about you because they're jealous, and then you're in conflict with this person, and then your ego is unchecked and someone needs to check you, and all of that comes along with that. So just to say like Fatima, like Fatima is very much a like behind the scenes worker in many ways. She was a huge part of the Abdul campaign. You were doing like organizing stuff on campus. You were part of things, and you didn't have to be front and center to be doing that work. And you didn't demand to be front and center. You just did it. And that's really valuable. And like, that's why people praise up and hold up people like Fatima, because I remember Fatima doing all this work with Abdul, like coming into the Trudeau town hall with us and like hugging Fatima and holding people down. And like, that is actually so valuable. And when you do that work, you'll be so beloved because people are like, Fatima doesn't ask anything for herself and she gives everything of herself, So that, like, let's be Fatimas, like that is the goal. That is what we want to do every day. So don't be discouraged. Don't be caught up in who gets attention. Don't let yourself be valued by a performative, superficial world. Value yourself and find the people that will value you because they are out here. So that's my answer to performative activism. I always give long answers. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Oh, wow, I'm like blushing. No, that's so sweet. Thank you all for your responses. I wanted to open it up to other folks too. Like, does anyone? Oh, we have a hand. I will take that hand. Manav, I think.
Hi, so I had a question for Christine. So I am a member of a lobbying nonprofit group known as Canadian Youth for Alliance and Climate Action. And we talk to real member of parliaments every week, and we give our points to them in order to make them um, lobby for the bill known as C12, which is for climate action, climate change. And I just wanted to know, like, how is it possible to conduct research on those MPs beforehand, before the meeting? And how can we just tell them our points? And how can we make the whole process? Because it's been just 1 month, and like I am a bit confused about these things. Like, how can we place our points to them? And just like, yeah, how can we talk to them properly and just tell them like what we want from them?
Thanks for the question. I mean, the work that you're doing in terms of meeting with MPs is a part of the work, but I think my caution is really that sometimes that work can take away from the work that is probably more going to lend itself to the change that you want to see happen. So, taking meetings with MPs should just be part of your work. And I think what you're saying is, I mean, you're doing what you can with that. The climate crisis issue is one that has been so much tied into neoliberalism. And I think what's happened is it's become this similar to how neoliberalism has us think about poverty, is that it's do you recycle, are you an individual who's involved in tackling the climate crisis in that way, and not about the activism that needs to see the shift in power, in terms of oil and gas and who has influence on the agenda and following the money and the things that we need to do. I don't actually think that we're going to see the kind of change that we need to see by meeting with the MPs. I think there's just too much at stake to shifting that system at this point for that to be effective. And I don't mean to not give you strategies for doing those meetings. And so I'm going to I think Elle is looking forward to say something, but I think there's so much compelling evidence that it's urgent that we shift fundamentally where a government is funding, how government is funding what, who's involved in making those decisions, what is a green job, all the things that neoliberalism has tried to ensure that we don't actually talk about. That I just don't see that meeting with MPs is necessarily the best and most effective way to do that. So I don't know if others want to add.
I think there can be reasons for meetings, but just be clear on those reasons. And like, this is something Desmond Cole always says, that when you find yourself in that meeting, you will find yourself following a script that you didn't know was written, but will come out of your mouth. When people ask you, like, how is your meeting with Trudeau? Everyone always says the same thing. Oh, it was great. Like, you know what I mean? Because like it's there in you. Oh, you know, oh no, I think a lot of progress is made, right? So if you're going to take the meetings, like, be very strategic, be very clear, use the meeting to challenge and really resist. Because like politicians are politicians, sorry, Lisa, but like politicians are politicians. They're good at this stuff. Like the job, I've met some awful, like have made awful policies, like charming, charismatic people, you know, like remember your name, remember details about you. They're good politicians, but then they like passing shit laws, you know what I mean? But in person, they will charm you because they are very good at that. So you just have to be really aware, like, why are you taking the meeting? Is there a purpose? What do you want to get accomplished? What are you going to work out of the meeting with? How are you going to convey that information to other people? If are you willing to walk out of the meeting if it doesn't go your way? Like, just, yeah, be really clear on those points and understand it as a piece of strategy, not a goal in itself. So, because otherwise, yeah, you'll meet with the environment officials and you're like, oh, it's great. I feel like we made progress. You didn't make any progress. They're just kicking the can down the road. So just, you know, but if you're coming in and you're like, I'm having this meeting because I know you're going to reject these demands, but I'm going to let you reject them so that then we can build a campaign off you rejecting them. Now your meeting has a point, right? So just, yeah, have your strategies in place. Know why you want that MP there. What strategize out, like if they accept what I'm saying, what am I going to ask and how am I going to push it forward? If they don't, how am I going to use that? If they want to follow up, how are we going to make that follow up a step forward, right? Like, make sure you're always focused on that.
I kind of want to bounce off of that where like I know a question earlier was like what are some mistakes or just some like learnings you've had in the past. That was actually one of mine where I would, you know, attend meetings. I would be invited to meetings with like administrators or certain people that, you know, we were trying to get our advocacy demands across to. But then, you know, now and like later on, I realized that, you know, those meetings were not, you know, the right like way to go. And it was kind of like almost a gatekeeping and safeguarding of information and things like that. And it was almost as if like it was to make their conscience feel good, you know, like, oh, it's okay because we set up this like one-on-one or one-on-two meeting with people. And really it was just kind of like, you know, check off a list. So like realizing that like that's one of my learnings of like, you know, no longer doing that, you know, because like you like folks have said that it's kind of like a way to almost evade the demands, but also like the work that needs to be done. Sorry, I think I interrupted Lisa, but I will let you go. Sorry, I just like thought of that and just like my experience with that.
Yeah, and I guess you know, I appreciate Elle's points really, because I think having clarity about why you're meeting and what you're, you know, like in advance, knowing what you're asking for, and also knowing if you're going to do a subsequent meeting, what is it that you want to hold that person accountable to? So somehow, you know, coming away from the meeting, uh, having gotten a response to something and then giving them a time frame on when you're going to go back to them to see if they have done that thing, and whether that thing is um you know, yeah, I mean, I have not been an MP. I hope to be an MP, but you know, is it speaking in parliament? Is it introducing you or like connecting you with somebody who is controlling? For example, in Nova Scotia recently, we were able to like finally shake the money out of the green fund, which is you know, paid for with cap and trade revenues, and you know, the money was sitting there but it hadn't been allocated, and some good things were actually funded by it, announced a couple of weeks ago. But then like, yeah, constantly pushing that forward so that there's a sense of that you're going to publicly hold them accountable, and you're not going to treat I really appreciate you know, that emphasis on transparency that I've heard from um, Elle today, you know, that you're not going to protect that conversation or end up being protective of that person because you've had a good conversation with them. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to discount the power of politicians. I always say that you know, I have certain superpowers and I'm still trying to figure out how they work. Like I'm still in the process of uncovering them. And so I don't want to hold people, I don't want to act like democracy doesn't matter. Um, but frankly, you know, an opposition member can speak more freely than a government backbencher. You're probably not going to get a meeting with a cabinet minister, but maybe that, you know, if you're going to have a meeting with a government backbencher, maybe it's because you're going to ask them for a meeting with the minister and you're going to hold them to account for that. And maybe they have some like um, some ability to support something at the level of their constituency that is going to, you know, shift something. I think again, it is about having the goals and then holding them accountable in some public way. And if you're doing that multiplied by ridings across the country, then that can help to shift the energy. I think that is what a lot of politics is like, is the energy um, in, you know, mobilized in defense of the status quo and the people who have power and have enjoyed privilege to date, or are politicians broadly speaking and others feeling that the energy is shifting towards actually um, you know, moving towards the world that we want to build. And so that's what those meetings can be a part of.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I like that's something that I'm really appreciative of, that insight, especially from, you know, someone who, you know, has to respond to these like meetings or just also demands, like knowing that, like for example, like having the time frame as well, like that it helps speed things up, I think. So these are all kind of just tips and tools that I think are really useful. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted to once again open it up to folks. Anyone has any questions, but also wants to kind of share your own experience, whether it be like in your workplace or within academia or government lobbying you've done in the past, and maybe things you want to share with everyone else. I'll give it a moment. You can just raise your hand or you can just start talking if you want, because I feel like folks, it's definitely, I'm not a morning person either, so, or at all actually. So I know I would be a little quiet on a Thursday morning.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah.
Oh, there was a question. Let's go with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I saw a hand.
Oh, is there?
Where did it go? Oh no, it's
that
gone.
was me.
Oh, was
I
it?
put it right down. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Aisha, and I'm a nursing student actually. So I just kind of wanted to tell everyone, like, I really appreciate all the discussion, and I feel like I've learned so much, and I feel like super enlightened, and this is exciting. But yeah, I just wanted to tell everyone a little bit about something that we've been doing in nursing, and then I have a question at the end. But so in the summer, we formed a little thing called the Nursing Student Advocacy Collective. And it was during the summer when when George Floyd was murdered and everything, like the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of at its height. And we started getting experiences of nursing students that had gone through the program before, our Black students, and like just like the microaggressions and discriminations that they'd experienced, and like being someone who's like, I'm not Black and I haven't like experienced this, but like it was like outrageous. It was like it was so saddening. And so we collected a bunch of these experiences and we put them out for everyone to read them. And then we also made up a petition for the School of Nursing to kind of acknowledge what was going on. And we had a bunch of demands in it for them, because like our nursing program, each semester, like we have 8 semesters and each one is like a cohort. And within those cohorts, like maybe we have about 100 people and maybe less than 10 are usually non-white people. And so like to be in a profession where you don't see yourself like you don't see leaders that reflect what you look like, or like when you do see people, like Keisha Jeffries wrote something about like Black nurses not being like just respected in the work field and being given like, you know, like the more physically demanding. And so like when you see that, it's like, it's not appealing whatsoever. Anyways, so yeah, we wanted the School of Nursing to make some changes, and we ended up we had a lot of meetings, and something I've learned from this now is that you don't actually always have to take meetings, and like it's important to go in with like an ask. And I think that's something we didn't always have. We were always just kind of going into meetings for discussion and just to kind of hear what they had to say and see if they had solutions, like the School of Nursing, and usually they didn't. But through like talking to them, and we've formed some, like we've become part of their like EDI committees, and we've recreated like admissions policies. So starting next year, there's going to be a no cap limit. As long as people meet the requirements for admissions, there's a no cap limit on how many non-white or any, like, so they call them like equity seeking groups. So there's going to be a no cap limit on how many applicants are accepted. So that's amazing, and we're really excited about that and everything. And then we're also looking at syllabus and like reframing that to reflect more diverse, you know, populations that we're going to be treating it in the hospitals and stuff. Anyways, so we have all this down, and we're expecting to have like a more diverse cohort in the future. But now it's like actually having the structures in place to support the students. And so we've been talking about that and coming up with like bursaries and support people that we can hire and that type of thing. But our biggest problem that we keep going back to is we have racist, or not racist, but, you know, like profs that are just making comments like microaggressions, and like we've talked to the School of Nursing, and they keep coming back to us saying that they can't make any profs do any kind of training. They can't like enforce any kind of like any like form of training, like equity diversity training. And like anytime there is like stuff like this, or like we had a workshop that Fatima put on for us about microaggressions, like it's always like preaching to the choir, where it's only like it's the BIPOC folk that even show up to these in the first place. It's not the people who actually need to hear the message. So like it kind of feels like we've hit a brick wall, where it's like we have all this stuff in place, but like I don't feel like we're going to be able to properly like support these students, because we're going to have profs that are going to be saying rude stuff to them. So it's just like, how do you get past like that one aspect of it? Like, I don't know if anyone has an answer for that, but yeah.
Ajay said in the chat that he's developing a white fragility clinic in the medical school with Dr. Gaynor Watson Creed, and maybe nursing faculty might attend that as well. So that's okay.
Is it like already in the works, or you're thinking like they should start like getting in on that?
It's definitely already in the works, where and we also have, there's another thing too called Safe Space for White Questions that I do with Alex Kasnavish every month. But the White Fragility Clinic in the med school, I think we're going to have our first sessions later this month. So it'll be taking off in a bigger way, hopefully every 2 weeks or so by the end of this semester, and it's going to run through the summer. And, you know, sorry to interrupt again, but it's just to say, you know, you were saying you don't want to say that your profs are racist, but, you know, I can tell you that your profs are probably racist. You know, that's how structural issues work. So we're going to work on them.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, oh, sorry. The White Fragility clinics, is it something that med school profs, like, because our problem is like, we can't get our profs to go to this stuff, to attend it. So I just don't know how to work around like making, like, because we can't make them do anything.
Yeah, you just send me an email after, and we can talk about that, because we're gonna make the Faculty of Medicine do it. So I think we can find ways to make the nursing department do it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I can connect you two together, by the way.
Yeah, and I just want to say that, I mean, you as students of color in the faculty, um, it, it, it strikes me as just wrong that you're being asked to make white profs with more power and privilege and status in the department attend something like, uh, and and yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that with Ajay's help, and but also maybe by finding a couple of, you know, a couple of allies within the faculty, you know, they can be demanded to, I mean, why isn't it happening? I'm sure that there's some annual all faculty meeting that happens. Why isn't it on that agenda? It shouldn't be an extra thing that is, you know, organized and put on by students. You know, absolutely, I think your participation in it would be like phenomenal, but it should be demanded by the faculty. And if not, then that's where I think you have the power, because you have met with them, to go public with them not, you know, not taking steps to address these issues. But then I just also want to just, it's making me think about the power of the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq program at Dal, which, you know, was started by Rocky Jones. And um, yeah, and it strikes me that we need more of those in, you know, we need those in the medical faculty, but Dal's not my playground, so I'll stop
Also,
there.
have you been to the union? Because like you can't make profs do things because it's not in people's contracts, and we don't have PD days as profs. Like that's not a thing. Like teachers have that, lawyers have that, professors do not have that, and so people resist anything that's outside the contract. So the question might be going up to the union and saying, can the union put some things on? I don't know. It's going to be difficult. I'll tell you that, because if yeah, like service is a requirement, but that doesn't include professional training. Like there's nothing, you don't have to take like remedial teaching training as a prof. Like once you're hired on a tenure track, like that's it. You know what I mean? Like, and the main thing is your research. So there isn't a lot of leverage. So, but I might try going through the union and seeing if they can at least collaborate and help talk to the nursing school about that. And the other thing is, if the nursing school, like the admin is committed, try and get somebody big. Like they like, you know, and then people will attend because it's like the big event to be seen at, and then work in the training that way. So if they're willing to fund it, then yeah, maybe it means bringing in, yeah, a keynote speaker that can talk about these issues, that some kind of like famous nurse that everybody will want to go suck up to and listen to. And then if that person also does the training, so you may have to get creative. And I guess the last thing is, don't blame yourselves. Don't put the burden on yourselves if you can't get it accomplished, because this is a huge, like this is about how universities, like fundamentally, like the structure of a university. And so if you don't manage to shift it, that doesn't mean you didn't work hard enough, or you didn't try hard enough, or you negotiated wrong. Like just understand that, like, yeah, profs don't do anything outside the requirement. Like that's just kind of a job thing. So if you're not successful, don't feel like you failed at it. I think that's really important, because often we take those burdens on ourselves and we're like, oh, if only I'd found the right words. And it's something beyond you in many cases. So if you're successful, that's amazing. If you're not able to do it, understand that that's the system.
Okay, that's some good advice. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aisha, for that, and also for all the responses and the tips. Like I never thought about the union, and like even within poli-sci and like the arts program at Dow, we need that too. We need things to become mandatory, because they're not, but they're much needed. I will actually have to transition over to Dr. Cameron, who will kind of be summing up and inviting the panel to do some last reflections, and then after there will be a closing. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fatima. And I'm not going to do any closing up. It's really just asking more questions and moderating and kind of sharing the work. I think we've got about a little bit less than 10 minutes left. And so I just really want to give the three panelists a chance to kind of share some final reflections. I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you, and you can ignore them or answer them. If there's something else you want to say, that's great. Probably better than responses to my questions. But here are a couple of things that came up for me, and I think that weave in some of the questions and comments through the session. One of them is about the emotional labor of activist work and advocacy work. And it was prompted by a comment that Christine made about kind of working in the context of I think what she called the nice, polite Nova Scotia culture, or the nice, polite culture of Nova Scotia politics, where everybody's friendly. There's this kind of surface level civility. Elle referred to the politicians as they're all charming. They'll remember your name. Everything's really nice. But at the same time, you're angry, you're frustrated, you're worked up, you're passionate about things, and that passion, energy, anger don't always mesh well with that nice, polite world of politics and official bureaucracy. So one question, I guess, to all three of you is how you navigate that. Do you hold back on your emotions to fit into the nice, polite world, or do you take your anger and energy and frustration with you? And then another question that I'll just pose, and again, you can answer my questions or you can highlight any final issues about advocacy and activism, is about allyship and privilege and solidarity, and whether that's around skin color, class, education, experience, just access to people in power. How you navigate the tensions and sometimes the uncomfortable position of having privilege, and then using that privilege to enable other people to try and support other people. So those are my two questions, but there may be other issues that you want to highlight, other things that you've heard in the session that you want to reflect on. We've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to, I'll say 6, so I'll give 2 to each of you. And Elle, I'll start with you.
Good, because I have to duck out like at the end because I have class at noon. So very quickly, no, you should not change yourself to fit the system. It's especially big, and as Christine talked about, or was it Lisa in Nova Scotia, the particular violent civility of Nova Scotia, which is where people will never say anything to your face, and then like they'll smile in your face, I think you're so wonderful, and then behind closed doors like, don't ever let that person in this building again, so I think your responsibility, particularly as an activist and advocate, is to not accept the notion of respectability and civility. That doesn't mean that you should go stomp on people, or you should, be cruel to people, or that you shouldn't be thoughtful in how you interact. But I think it does mean that those civility laws are there to protect power. Who decides what is civil or not, and these are all inventions. They're social inventions, like the idea of, oh, well, you shouldn't, like, obviously, yeah, like if you're in a meeting with somebody, you should probably let them talk, but once you've heard what they have to say, if you want to get up and walk out, that's on you. If you want to tell them, I think that you're lying to me, say it, I don't think you should be dishonest in your interactions. And I think civility is usually about protecting power and then protecting your own relationship to that. So the question isn't, I think, civility or even anger. The question is strategy, right? That what am I here to do? What is meaningful, and who am I advocating for, and why? And I think we base ourselves off those questions. But remember, yeah, like those windows will shift. What was uncivil tomorrow will be the thing we all believe in today, right? So I think it's about staying true to that. What was the second question? You're on mute now.
You're muted, Dr. Cameron.
Oh, you're still muted.
I don't know how many Zoom meetings you have to go through and to remember to unmute. Ella, I was just trying to say on mute that I was going to go over to Christine just so we can wrap up on time. Thank you.
And Christine should ask this question about the profit complex.
Christine, over to you.
Thanks. I mean, I would echo what Elle just said. I don't hold back. I think obviously there's a gendered and raced way that this plays out, right? People often comment about how passionate I am when I've just given a lecture with 1,000 different evidence and expertise, and I'm passionate. Yeah, I am, and I'm angry, and it feeds my activism and my commitment to do the work. And I definitely don't apologize for that, but it does also make me angry that women, Black women, people who are not white men are particularly, called out or seen as being angry. And often it's because, all of the things that Elle just outlined, right? So I think you need to go into this with who you are and be clear on what you are trying to gain. And I think one of the things I'd say is I'm often asked, what's the one thing? Or there isn't one thing. There is no shortcut. I wish I could say that there isn't. But what I take from the work that I do, and I think what you've heard here today, is that this work feeds me. You know, I would never have made it through my PhD without the Women's Caucus at that university. And that Women's Caucus was very much about having wine and cheese and just supporting each other. But it was also the Women's Caucus where, you know, they'd read your draft and they'd give you feedback. There is no shortcut, and we need to be continually doing the work, and hopefully that's positive for you. And if it's not, then you know, this is likely not the work for you. But also, the other thing I'd say is we need more people who have the power, who are not using their power to be doing this work. And so, speaking to, you know, we think allyship. I think my fellow profs, those who are physicians, our nurses, those who are in the system who actually have power are not using their power in a way to challenge those systems. And we need to actually be building those connections and have them use your power because you have it. Tenure track professors, you can't lose your job. Right, John? You're not like, how many hundreds of profs do we have in this province? How many hundreds of physicians and nurses and others who could be using their power to build towards making the kinds of changes that, again, I think Lisa pointed to this, would benefit us all. And I do want to say one last thing, and that is that electoral politics and who you vote for obviously matters. And my point is, you know, we need to be doing that organizing work between elections. The vote is one of the ways, and I think we see to the south of us how powerful that can be, but also that we need to be supporting those who you vote in order to create that space for the change to happen, right? It's not, nothing magic happens when you're voted in and you become an MLA or an MP, and Elisa can speak to that. If there isn't this solidarity on the ground to support the work moving forward, but obviously that is a key part. So there's no shortcut. You need the evidence to support your claim. You need the evidence to counter the counterclaims. You need to build the allyships and the solidarity, and you need to do that electoral politics side too. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Christine, a lot. And Lisa, over to you for just some final thoughts.
Yeah. So I jotted down some words in response to your questions. And I'm just going to read the words and see if you can make the connection between them. Politeness, bravery, change, theater, liberation bound up with each other. Yeah, I have moments in the legislature where I say things that are more true than some other things. And I have a challenge, which is that I sometimes cry when I say things that are really true. And also sometimes when I say things that are really true, my heart pounds. And I haven't had that experience very many times, but I have had it, and the heart pounding one. And I had it last February when I made a member statement that also quoted the song by Oh Sound Lee. And it was right after a young Black man had been stopped outside the Bedford Mall. And I felt like I was speaking truth that was unwelcome in that room. And I mean, that visceral experience, which, you know, a pounding heart is sort of like, wait, what happens when you're afraid? And I guess I kind of think about this stuff both, you know, politically and economically, but also like emotionally, that we have to, I guess, recognize that people experience fear, and the feeling can be true, even if, like I have a lot of power and I have a lot of privilege. I'm an MLA, and yet I can experience fear because I'm speaking truth in a room where it feels like I'm not saying what everybody wants to hear. And I think that matters because while you know, so much of this work is about knowing exactly what your goals are and who you can count on and all that. I also think we have to leave space where people can change and be inviting people to like step into those like more authentic experiences of of being brave. And ultimately it comes back to you know, our liberation is bound up with each other. And I ultimately think that a lot of the things that we're pushing for are actually good for all of us, because nothing is good for any of us if it's not good for all of us.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Those are great, inspiring words about just the need for courage among people who often seem so comfortable to know that inside your heart can still be beating fiercely. And you know, I can feel the blood come into my face and blush when I get passionate and excited about something, and I forget the words I'm using, and I get all flustered. And it's I think helpful to all of us to know that that happens to everyone, including someone who regularly speaks in Province House. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Ajay just to wrap up and thank everyone.
Thank you so much to our three outstanding panelists. I just wanted to, I just wanted to say kind of like a couple of things that I heard in the big picture over the course of these last 2 hours to share with everyone. And we will make this recording available to everyone later. So one important lesson I learned here was it's critical to understand how systems meaning things like racism, sexism, classism, etc., how systems as well as institutions, which are something physical like parliament, bureaucracy, and universities operate. We can't be naive about the structures. We need to study them. We need to study the people inside them, and we need to act decisively and purposefully in all of our actions. The second thing that I learned was meet with people strategically and ensure that you always have an ask when you meet with them. Especially when those people might have the power to change things and influence things. And then relatedly, know when you need to walk away so that they're not draining your energy. The third thing, read the situation and be accountable to the communities that you serve and that you are a member of. And then the related part of this is do the work needed to be able to work alongside people, as opposed to speaking on behalf of someone else, which I think for anybody in development studies, certainly this is an absolutely fundamental issue. And then the fourth thing that I learned today was don't accept that the answers people who have power are prepared to give you are actually the answers. You have to develop your own solutions, and you need to do that publicly so that it can't be ignored. So in that, I think I've heard a lot about the way that activism, advocacy kind of goes together, about some of the differences between them. And I just wanted to offer my sincere, heartfelt thanks to everybody involved today, to Elle, to Christine, to Lisa for sharing so candidly and openly and being willing to at times I think go out of your comfort zones to do this, to share this learning with us. I want to thank John and Fatima, who have been my co-conspirators with this on the last 2 years, well, a year at least, we've been talking about this. And finally, of course, not finally, but all of you participants who have been active in the chats, who have been willing to share some of your experience and expertise in the second session. Thank you so much for making this a vibrant and interactive space, despite our online limitations. And then, of course, thank you to the institutions that helped make this possible. ACIC, the CCPA, the McEachern Institute, and the Department of International Development Studies, where John and I work. So with that, we are only 3 minutes over time. So I'd say this is a good day. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you both on the streets and in the halls of power.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great roundup, Ajay.